Boris Johnson was clearly bamboozled by the science during the COVID pandemic, and it was often a challenge to help him understand the graphs and the data. That is the bombshell claim from the government's chief scientific advisor during the pandemic, who's been giving evidence to the public inquiry today. Sir Patrick Vallance recalled the former Prime Minister having his head in his hands a lot and forgetting information he'd only been told a few hours ago.
And I think he'd be the first to admit it wasn't his forte, and that he did struggle with some of the concepts, and we did need to repeat them often. It was hard work sometimes to try and make sure that he had understood what a particular graph or piece of data was saying. Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings were extremely keen to get scientific advice. So they had I would say, a disproportionate interest in getting science advice. But as you can see, it wasn't always easy to provide it in a way that was understood and actionable by the Prime Minister.
And joining me now, Ruby Lott-Lavigna, political reporter at Open Democracy, and Dr. Saleyha Ahsan, who lost her father to COVID. Thank you both very much indeed for joining me. Let's start with Ruby, because Ruby, I think, is the only reporter in the universe who has actually been present for every single uttered syllable of the inquiry. A glutton for punishment, Ruby, no question about that. But tell me about this latest analysis of the Prime Minister as bamboozled by science. And so many of us who, like the Prime Minister, gave up the sciences at the age of 15 or even earlier, will also have our head in our hands thinking, my gosh, we couldn't have done any better had we been in that position. I mean, he wasn't elected because he was meant to be a scientist, was he?
No, finding graphs and data quite tricky. But I do think that what's really coming out from the inquiry today is really the surprise that, you know, the most senior politician in the country couldn't really wrap his head around a lot of the data and the science with, you know, the best scientific team around him, and with, you know, at the most important time when, you know, potentially possible.
I mean, did you feel appalled by this, or did you think, well, that wasn't really his function? When he kept saying, we will follow the science, it was incumbent upon the scientists, Patrick Vallance, Chris Whitty et al., to explain clearly to him, give him a decent top line, so he knew what the country should or shouldn't be doing according to the science. He didn't have to understand every molecular structure and the very nature of virology to be able to do this adequately, did he? I don't know whether this is a waste of all our time thinking about Boris being bamboozled and having his head in his hands, or whether we feel the country would have maybe acted differently had he passed his biology O-level. I really don't know.
Look, I think we expect from senior politicians them to have a kind of good comprehension of all different areas that could affect policy, you know, whether that's science, whether that's economics. And something that's been mentioned in the inquiry is that, you know, politicians weren't saying, oh, we're being led by the economics here when talking about kind of policy decisions, because the assumption is that they will it's all this understanding that politicians have no idea what science means and they couldn't possibly understand data, and it's really hard. But actually, in a lot of other countries, people do have a good grasp of that. And I think, you know, the UK is quite unique in the fact it's very imbalanced in terms of the kind of people that get into government. They aren't largely kind of scientifically educated, usually in the humanities. But I completely empathize. You know, data is really, really hard and graphs are hard. But I do think we could have high expectations potentially for our Prime Minister to understand those kind of things.
Gosh, I think this is an absolute waste of time, this conversation about whether Boris did or didn't study science past the age of 15. I really do. I think the responsibility is for those communicating the data to be able to explain, what it is, and B, why it matters, C, what it signifies, and then D, for him to decide what to do about it. Is the implication, therefore, that because he didn't understand it, he made wrong decisions based on that misunderstanding? Or is the implication just having a pop at Boris for not understanding it, but really he was effectively ultimately governed by the science, so must have understood it in the end?
So Sir Patrick Vallance was actually specifically asked this. He was asked whether Boris Johnson completely misunderstood some of the advice that he was given as a kind of result of this lack of comprehension. And the answer that was given was possibly, and that he couldn't, Sir Patrick Vallance, information in his head at the same time. So, you know, it is likely that it was misunderstood if he wasn't really comprehending a lot of the graphs or the data. And I think, you know, obviously, like, a lot of science is complicated, but you know, some of the things that it seemed that Johnson was bamboozled specifically, I don't think is necessarily something he should have been confused by as the person leading the country at a time when a bit of scientific understanding was really crucial.
Yes, but you would have thought that he would have had innumerable personal private secretaries, ministers, and general communicators available to explain this in words of one syllable that any dolt could comprehend, wouldn't you? And you would also think that since it was the most pressing matter of the day, if he failed to comprehend it, they would repeat it until he did, or break it down into manageable bite-sized chunks so that he did. We're about to discuss Ofsted on the programme in a few minutes' time. You know, that if he really did need improvement, they would have carried on persisting until he was doing better and understood. Is any of this attributable to his having had COVID so very seriously himself and therefore possibly suffering the symptoms of long COVID, or maybe sickening before he actually had it, so he wasn't able to retain the information because he just simply was very, very ill?
This was raised in the inquiry, and Sir Patrick Vallance basically said that he behaved in a very similar way before and after he was ill. So I don't think it can, at least in Sir Patrick Vallance's, you know, that's the key thing with the inquiry. We're only hearing Sir Patrick Vallance's position right now, and we will hear from Boris Johnson, you know, in the coming weeks, and he will be able to put to us why actually the data was really complicated and it was so normal that he could understand it and the scientists were rubbish. But of course, you know, he was appointing them, and he probably had some responsibility to kind of comprehend the science a bit better than maybe he did.
Let's bring Dr. Saleyha Ahsan into this. Now, this is somebody who we know, because I've interviewed her many times on this programme, does understand the science. So thank you for joining me. I wonder whether you think that this is an utter waste of time, this conversation about whether Boris Johnson was or was not bamboozled, or did or didn't have his head in his hands. And, you know, we know that he's written entire books in Latin. We know he composes Latin hexameters. We know he's a great historian and knows a tremendous amount about Churchill. That's what he was doing. He wasn't doing science. It doesn't mean, though, that you can't have it explained clearly to you to the point where you do need to understand, and you do understand what it is they're trying to communicate, surely.
I think what was really interesting today on reviewing the entries by Patrick Vallance into his diaries was the manner in which Boris Johnson was behaving as well, that he didn't seem to be someone who was, you know, demonstrating a great deal of patience in trying to understand the science. There's lots of diary inputs that state that, you know, he was slamming down papers, he was, you know, getting, you know, the words that I remember, you know, agitated, you know, suggested that he was getting agitated. So probably wasn't the easiest student to sort of pass that information on to. But I think what was said by Lavigna before was, well, I think is quite true, because I was feeling this myself, that there seems to be a real lack of MPs. There was a really interesting report done even prior to COVID about the concern within British politics about how little experience within the sciences and healthcare there is within you know, British politics, politicians, for example, compared to other countries. What I also found really, really interesting during the time of COVID was that Boris Johnson tended to lean on the scientific advisors who seemed to be able to maneuver what they were stating to what Boris Johnson was hoping they'd say. I here want to recall a really, really interesting interview that I watched between Boris Johnson and Jenny Harris, who is now the head of UK Health Security Agency, who we'll hear from later, discuss whether we should be wearing face masks. And there was Jenny Harris to back him up with her interpretation of science, to say we shouldn't really be wearing masks. So I think he understood the importance of having science at the table. And then if he didn't like what was being said, this was my impression when I was viewing it, from one of the scientific advisors, he'd go shopping until he found someone who'd say it the way that he wanted.